Welcome, welcome, welcome. So excited for another P&G Alumni Network Enrichment Series webinar. I'm going to give people a chance to jump onto the webinar before we officially start. But I'm so excited to be returned back as the host this month. I think we're going to have a great conversation. All right, so we're ready to start. So hello, whether it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, welcome to this month's edition of the P&G Alumni Network Enrichment Series. I am your host, Dr. Andrea Bowens-Jones. I'm excited to be here with my co-host or the presenter today, whom I will introduce here shortly. But a few things before we get started today about the Enrichment Series webinar. One, it is a monthly series. So if this is your first time here, welcome. Welcome back to those that are returning and welcome to those that are here. But we meet monthly and we have a variety of topics that we cover, and the intent is to connect members, P&G alumni from all over the globe, to provide insight and leverage the expertise of all of our presenters. So one, it will produce action as you return back to your workplaces. So who we are as a network, we are former P&Gers, over 35,000 members worldwide and over 45 chapters. We are officially recognized and supported by P&G, and the connections that we have, whether through our webinar series or a variety of local events, are all meant to produce connections, enrichment, and we have philanthropy efforts through our P&G Alumni Foundation. A few announcements. So go ahead and mark your calendar. More information will follow. Every 2 years, we have a global conference. If you were with us last year, we had that one in Cincinnati. This one in fall 2023. It will hopefully be in person. So we're excited about the opportunity to connect again, but to do it in person. The location we're looking for to having it in DC area, where we hope that it will be a multi-day event as with previous conferences, but we'll have keynotes and panels and really great opportunities. And you can see a list on the screen of all the places that we've been before. So we're hoping to have much more. So watch your calendars and your email boxes for additional details. So a little bit about the setup for today. So if this is your first time joining us and you're not familiar with the way that the Zoom webinar works, I want you to pay attention to the bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A box. There'll be time at the end of today's presentation for us to engage in conversation. And you'll do that by dropping your questions into the Q&A box. I'll be able to monitor those and ask our presenter to be able to respond to it. You can also use it throughout. So don't wait until the Q&A portion, but go ahead, as those questions pop into your head, go ahead and put them into the Q&A box. All right, so there are a few polls just so we can have an idea of who is in the room with us before we present today. So I want you to take a moment and answer the polls as they appear on the screen. And you should see the first poll appearing now. A few more minutes. And make sure you take a moment to answer all the questions. Let us know where you are in the world. Let us know what industry you're in. And let us know if you're involved in a local chapter. All these things help us to better target our webinars and also to build content that we know that will matter to all those that attend. It looks like we have just about everybody. So the poll will be closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. I know I'm excited to get started. How about you, Billy? You ready to get started?
I'm very excited to get started.
Yes. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Billy Lagor, he's a Senior VP of Brands at Senior VP of Brand at Constellation Brands. And I'm going to stop the share so I can tell you all about Billy before he gets started. So over the past decade or so, companies have been focused on transformation initiatives, digital transformation, operational transformation, cultural transformation, et cetera. The underlying need, though, is not limited to transformation initiatives, which are often great catalysts to change, but to create a culture and norms that embrace transformation as an endemic state. Today's discussion is about sharing one person's learning, often the hard way, on creating cultures that embrace constant change and leverage transformation as a daily muscle to drive competitive advantage. Now, about our speaker, Billy. He's currently Senior VP, as I mentioned, Brand Management, Wine and Spirits at Constellation Brands, leading many of the world's finest brands in the category, such as Meiomi, Kim Crawford, Robert Mondavi, Private Selection, Woodbridge, and Svedka. I know I messed that one up, Billy, so you'll have to correct that for our.
All good.
Yes. Prior to that, he served 18 months as Chief Growth Officer at Juice Plus, where he remains a member of the board of directors. Before that, he spent over 15 years at Hasbro, one of the world's largest brand play companies, and he began in brand management on brands such as G.I. Joe and Marvel, and later headed up commercial marketing for both APAC and the U.S. before being appointed to the regional president, GM, for APAC, and starting the global e-commerce function for the company. Billy started his career in healthcare at P&G, where he worked in new business development, oral care, and pharmaceuticals. He graduated with a BA in history from Yale University and MBA from Harvard Business School. He currently lives in San Francisco with his partner, Noah, and their pup, Wally. All right. I'm excited. I'm gonna go ahead and pull your presentation up, and you correct all those things I said wrong today as you go through your presentation.
No, you got it all, Andrea. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be back in the hallowed halls of P&G. As fellow alumni know, it's certainly a place that shapes us and helps us as leaders. So I'm taking a look. It looks like we're still sharing the screen. Or is that still pulling up? So I'll give that a second to to get up there.
Is your presentation up? Can you see it now?
I cannot see it yet.
Okay.
I'm not sure if others can.
Let's try that again. What about now?
It's circling for me. I don't see a presentation yet.
I
don't know if there's a way others can jump in and let you know if they're seeing it. Maybe it's just not on my screen.
I'll stop the share. Let's give it a second. Make sure we're not having any technical issues on my end. You see it now?
I don't. Do you want me to try to share it from my screen?
Yes, we may have to.
Okay, excuse me if I get small or something for a second.
I can try one more time. I closed some windows just to make sure. Our attendees could see the presentation, Billy.
Okay, interesting. Well, then I guess I'll just see if we're on the same slide then. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. So if you want to go on, I'll just give a slide number and I can see it on my other screen. Oh, there we go. Now it shows, there we go. Now it's showing here.
Hey.
Sorry about everybody.
Oh, great. I feel like I almost need to introduce you again. Okay.
I know.
Thank you.
It would be a presentation without technical difficulties. So Anyway, thank you again, Andrea, and excited to jump in, talking about creating a culture of always on transformation. And, if you go to the next slide, what really kind of gave the idea of this conversation, an amazing alumni named Liana Rojas talked to me a while ago about doing this. And, we were talking about different topics that would be interesting. One that really came to mind is, as we were, by the way, so Ilya worked in P&G Mexico, and then we worked together at Hasbro. And then we talked about this presentation not too long ago as we started preparing. And one of the topics we talked about is how the speed of business has changed. And so today what we want to talk about is the case for always on, why we would have always on transformation, as well as some tips for how to do that. And the idea sprouted, when we're talking about what it took to be successful 25 years ago when we both started our careers to where we are today. And a lot of that came to this idea of replacing best practice culture with an always learning culture. And it's built around this idea that what was good yesterday will be average today and obsolete tomorrow. And it's something I've thought a lot about, and it's inspired from a book from Thomas Friedman called Thank You for Being Late. And what I'd like to do to set up and talk about the case, if you will, for always on transformation. We'll talk a little bit about contextualizing some of the key points that he made. But you see on this slide a picture of Moore's Law. And for those who are familiar, this was basically this idea that processing speed, right? So things that kind of run our computers were doubled every 2 years, right? Or approximately every 2 years. But what happens with that is in the beginning, you have change that's relatively slow and not as noticeable. But when you start hitting those big numbers, change happens rapidly, right? So if you think about 2 times 2, you go from 4 to 8, to 16. Those numbers don't seem that big, but when you go from 20 million to 40 million to 80 million, you see massive change in a very short period of time. And that's one of the fundamental kind of theses that it comes up with, is we're now at this pace in technology where things are moving so quickly, it's hard to keep up, but we have to change the way that we do business. If you look at the next slide, please. He gives a few examples of this, and the first example he gives is actually cars. It's automotive, and if you think about it, driving or cars became mass part of our culture in the early 1900s, and driving up until, call it, the 80s or 90s was pretty much the same formula at the same time, right? It was stop signs and street lights, speed limits, and other than growth in highways, the basic formula was the same. And the same thing for navigating is basically maps, right? Mapping the US and the world, and then just following those. But if you think about the changes in the past 20 years, right? So navigation has completely changed. You've gone from maps to technologies like MapQuest to Garmin's to phones, and now we have self-driving cars that could practically get you from Boston to San Francisco without ever touching the wheel, right? A massive amount of change in just 20 years. And if you think even the idea of owning your own car, right? Everyone had their family, we had the family Pinto, like so many American families, and then you quickly fast forward, and now you're in the world of Zipcar, Uber, Lyft, and all of that has fundamentally changed in such a short time. If you think about legislation, and people aren't fully caught up with it, right? Are drivers workers? Are they part-time workers? How do you legislate, an automated car? What happens if there's an accident? Is it the car owners? Is it Google's fault, right? So, the idea here is that change has happened so fast, and we're still catching up with what to do with that. The other example that Friedman gives in his book, certainly one near and dear to my heart, was the idea of gay rights. And if you think about it, this was a great social example. If you think about up till the 1970s, right, being gay in America was not only illegal, it was literally viewed as a sickness. It was in the American Psychological Association had called it a sickness. And then that changed in the 70s where they said, actually, no, it's normal. And then if you look at the 90s, you had employment equality, military, domestic partnership, marriage, trans rights, all this happening in 20 years. And if you think about just the social implications, right? I think of my mom who was born in 1931, and for her first 40 years, she thought having a gay son was a sickness. And now all of a sudden, you have marriage and all these other things happening. It's the idea that just it's a lot for people to process in a really short amount of time. So much so that we sometimes can't keep up. And to me, and what Friedman talks about, that really applies to business. Next slide, please. And so if we think about, just how things like advertising have changed, right? Starting at P&G in the mid 90s, it was all about the TV commercials, all about push messaging. If we look what's happened in the last 20 years, we now have, we've gone from a push messaging where we basically gave our message to consumers, right, through TV screens. Now we have social media, millions of interactions, consumers driving the agenda, community management becoming so important. We've seen retail go from global big box dominance to, from a really national big box dominance to global omni-channel same day deliver, where players from around the world can get us products, incredible price transparency, and the removal of physical location. So the idea here is there's just been so much change in the past 20 years, and this pace of change is really accelerating, which requires us to think differently. Next slide, please. And to put this into context, I think back to my early days at P&G, and certainly for those on the call who may have been around in the 90s, remember this. It's very different, right? Like the culture of P&G, of course, as now as it was then, amazing. But the focus certainly as a brand marketer was all about learning the formula, right? We had a group called Advertising Services, Marketing Services. I don't know if they're still around, but basically the focus of this group was teaching us the formula for great advertising, and the amount of research and understanding, and how to develop a creative brief, and what type of insights need to go in, how to formulate that brief, how to create a storyboard, the right way to interact with an agency, production, media, everything. There was a formula that we had that it was really about kind of doing the research, inserting in this formula, right? And the same thing with media. If you were launching a brand, it was on 14 weeks at 400 GRPs, and then you went down to 200 for sustaining period. I mean, there was literally a formula that you could learn, right? And tremendous research. And so much of the skill set that made P&G, made companies great, was those that could understand the formula. And the reason is because up until that time, the formula was relatively consistent, maybe tweaked here and there, but you could use data and learning to really perfect the formula. Next slide, please. And I thought I should just share, when I started Hasbro. So for those who don't know, Hasbro is the largest branded play company in the world. So you see some of the brands, G.I. Joe, Transformers, Return of the Jedi. They did not do He-Man. But when I started or at least coming out of the 80s, these were some of the biggest shows. And again, back to this idea of a formula, in the 80s, so I worked in boys' toys. So that's the inspiration for everything that you see in front of you. But again, there was a formula, and they called it show and toy, toy and show, right? So it's basically get your shows on the air and copy what you see on the shows in the toy line. And in the 80s, that worked really well because you only had 3 to 4 TV shows that boys were watching. You only had 3 to 4 TV channels. And again, like the conversation with Moore's Law, what you saw is rapid change coming out of that, right? In the 80s, there wasn't tons of competition. A movie could last a show for several years. And then what happened is you had this tremendous increase. I don't know if folks remember, but the 80s are when cable started coming to town. So you went from having 3 or 4 stations to literally hundreds. And then you added Netflix and YouTube and creator content. And now what used to be a world of very commanded attention for the 8 to 10-year-old boy is now one of unlimited distraction. And that really changed the game, right, as a toy maker, on how do you get that attention, where before you were guaranteed attention because every boy in America is watching the same 3 or 4 shows, and now there's unlimited ways to get someone's attention. Next slide, please. And so this really gets to this idea of rapid acceleration everywhere, right? And to be clear, I use 2 consumer products examples. It's really everything around us. It's media and communication. It's retail and the growth of omnichannel. It's procurement and supply chain. The advances there. You can put a chip and know exactly where your boat is on the water, bringing your products from overseas. And it's things like consumer visibility into the inner workings of where companies are. We're again going from push messaging to consumer engagement. And this really is the pivot. It's changing our mindsets from being a learning practice, right, or from a best practice development to learning how to adapt, right, and also how to lead and manage in a world of overwhelming data points. Next slide, please. And so this kind of gets into the need for an always on culture of transformation. And to be clear, the fundamentals are the same. And I hope if there's Tide folks on here, I'm not getting this wrong. It's been a few years, but Tide has always been the best clean you can get that you can trust, rooted in the best product available and built on a track record of generations, right? That I would imagine for the Tide team is fundamental and is not going to change anytime soon, nor should it, right? And always on transformation doesn't mean that those fundamentals change, right? the importance of the consumer, the importance of the moment of the truth, having the best product. Those are fundamentally the same, but what's changed are the communication pieces of it, right? And I think I used example, in the 80s and 90s, you could pretty much push to consumer your message, and there really wasn't a lot of conversation back there. Weren't the venues for conversation. Now with social media, and with emerging social media, right? Because even that has changed, right? In 2008 to 2010, it was Facebook. Now it's TikTok, right? So even the methods of social media are changing. They're forcing us to change and to keep up. And the key idea here is, how do we accept and embrace this, right? So first, this is the new reality. And second, once we accept the new reality, it can really become an opportunity for competitive advantage. So now I want to just go into a few ways to win in this world, if you will, of always on transformation. Next slide, please. And so the first is to drive I call it a learn and scale approach to business, right? In the past, we tended to have a set and go mindset, right? And if you think about it, and again, I'll use an example from my early P&G days. I remember working on Fixing It. We spent 8 to 9 months developing the positioning, right? And it was really more of a tweak of positioning, but we did qualitative data, quantitative data. We did focus groups in 8 or 9 cities, all to get the insight and the creative brief. Then worked on several different, storyboards, versions of advertising, tested it, we were ready to go, right? So almost a year process to get this message that was really a push message to consumer, right? There wasn't a way for consumers to talk to us. So we had a year almost in total to get to this process. And then that was something that we then kind of played, that we then worked with consumers on and kept it for a year, right? So it was really a develop, set, and go. And, because of the long process, if things weren't working and you learned something, you might tweak or reshoot a spot, but it wasn't a quick, agile way to make a change, right? We really had to get the research and be right? And, we used research to validate that. We did bases, we did ARS testing, we did all these things to make sure that by the time it went on air, we were pretty sure of the result, right? The ability to do that now has really changed a lot, right? And, if you think now, we have the ability to do things like, small scale A/B testing on an execution. This could be even, just certain words change, just certain images change, right? We can do multivariate creative testing approaches that give us real-time feedback. We can put up social posts where consumers actually engage, and we can see what was interesting, what do they comment on, what do they notice, right? So our ability to test before scaling is very different than it was before, right? We can do small scale or small batch testing, and get insights that we didn't have. And this gives us a lot of opportunity because it actually gives us real consumer feedback and seeing how they interact with, a piece of advertising, or copy. And we're in the process now of building this capability, certainly at CBI and many other companies. And it's exhilarating and unnerving at the same time, because so much of what we've been taught is a set and go approach. And now we're going in there saying, hey, we have hypotheses, we can test them, we can small batch test them, and we can pivot. But it's also an iterative process, right? Where before the process was get all the inputs, create and go. Now it's iteration, take it in, and it may pivot us in directions that we weren't prepared for. Number two, sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. Number two key to winning and always on state of transformation is learn to trust deeper in the organization. And to me, this is one of the most interesting ones. Again, when I think back at when I started P&G, you basically had the the CMO, senior management, really reviewing storyboards and all of our key creative. And you could do that because while we had a lot of brands, we didn't have unlimited brands, and that was the primary vehicle. So if we got feedback on that creative, then you could have kind of senior management, if you will, involved in a high percentage of our interactions, with consumers, especially because it was such a push environment. Today, that's impossible. If you think of how much brands are creating, right? We have to work on our social content, work with influencers. We have to create targeted micro content, and we have to leverage community management where we have teams of people who may be responding on behalf of our brand. No manager can take a look and see every single data point, right? If you think of a big brand, how many people come in every day and have feedback on Tide or Crest, right? And it could be anything from, I love this brand, to this isn't working, to I couldn't find this at retail. But we have so many millions of touch points coming in that you have to empower a broader organization to be able to help manage the message. It can no longer be something where a senior team can look at advertising and most of your messaging out is controlled. It's such a two-way dialogue, and there's so many touch points that we have to empower organizations to be able to speak on behalf on our brands. And to a big degree, that means giving up control, right? Because brand message is no longer a monolithic push. It's a culmination of all of these touch points. And the big skill change, right, in an always on organization is that we go from setting what that message is to having to think about how to hire and develop decision makers who can work within a framework, but ultimately will have to use their judgment in interacting with consumers. So you have so many more people touching consumers directly, and it's all about empowering them to be on message, right? Versus just creating the message that they see. And I think an example that we see that's done this so well is Chewy.com. And for those who are familiar with Chewy, Chewy is they basically sell pet supplies, pet food. And one of the things they've done so beautifully is, as you can imagine, a lot of people have pets. They have replenishment, subscription, and you have that awful moment for those of us pet owners when a pet passes away. Call Chewy and say, "I just got this auto subscription for food. I don't need it. What do I do?" And what Chewy has become so tremendous at is, as they have these conversations, you'll often have that customer service person send them a bouquet of flowers. "I'm so sorry." Say, "Hey, can you take this to a local animal shelter and just donate it on behalf of your pup or your cat or your animal?" And by doing this, they've empowered all of these people who interact with consumers to give them a really beautiful experience with the brand, right? But that's certainly directed from the top, but not controlled, because these are individual conversations and they're executed on an individual level, right? And that's the value of learning to trust deeper in an organization, is that you have to set the guidelines for people to interact. You can no longer have that one specific super controlled message. Next slide, please. So one of the third things in developing an always on culture of transformation is this idea of driving greater focus on the core tenets of the brand, knowing the parameters need to function in more places. And this relates to what we just talked about, but it's finding ways to define the brands or goals, knowing that it's going to work across multiple mediums, including some mediums that may be unpredictable, right? And I'll give one of the examples from my world right now. Those are familiar with Kim Crawford wine. It's an awesome wine. It's one of my favorites. It's the Sauvignon Blanc, leading into new things like Prosecco's and Rosés, and locale. And where we came to with that was, the brand is all about making amazing people, amazing situations. It's really just about making life better. We want joy. And as we think about developing this brand position, certainly we can have our full range of, here's how we want the brand to seem. We always want to have it in this with the glass and flowers in back, wherever that may be. But the reality is there are so many ways now that we have talked to consumers, that consumers create content, that we can't be that prescriptive anymore. We really need to focus on this broad message and work with all of the folks interacting with the brand and make sure they understand this core. And what it means for brands today is that when we develop our brand equities, we need to be comfortable with the fact that we can get to, say, 90% coverage, because there's going to be some situations which we have not thought of that come up, right? What happens when someone brings our wine to a situation we never thought they would? That's great, but we may not have planned for that. So you have to be comfortable with the fact that you can't have complete coverage. What we have to do, and this goes back to the idea of trusting our people, is that we train them on how to interact when the unexpected comes up. Next slide, please. And this is a key one too, is this is the idea that playbooks and best practices need to be built more around process than specific content. And to be clear, you always want to get the learnings on what's working. This is not to say you never look at what's working today, because it won't be relevant tomorrow. We want to understand what's working, who's doing it well, everything from strategy to tactics. So this is not saying that that's not important. What it is saying, though, is that the key going forward is about creating processes that help us learn and move forward. So if we see an amazing TikTok campaign from someone, it's not just about what's the campaign, it's why did it work? Why did it work on TikTok? Would it work other places? And what was the process that enables us to get there? And one of the things that we're in the process of doing right now is bringing together groups that you used to not kind of connect, right? Marketers, media experts, but also data science to help us do this. And the focus is on pathways to learn. And really, how do we build up that muscle of testing hypotheses, getting more open-ended data, and then continue to test and learn? right? So the focus is more on how do we build an engine that will help us take these data points, synthesize them, versus just what was a specific execution that we can then learn from and replicate. Number 5, we must get comfortable with being with more data-driven cultures, especially in the advertising and creative parts of the business. And this is really important too, because again, when you think of the previous cultures have said it, I won't say set and forget, but set and monitor and go. We have to be open to the fact that there's a lot more data that can help us both before as we develop, say, a campaign, but also while we're going through the campaign. And one of the things that's different is, we often need to be open to learning the unexpected, right? Data can drive investment or redirect investment. It can redefine decision-making and give us a lot more granularity in our targeting and our message. But I think the key here is we have to get ready for the fact that whatever we do, we're going to learn something. And whether it be, the learning may be to amplify it, it may be to do more, to tweak, to edit, or to stop and redirect. But the idea is, as we get more data, the expectation is that we act on that data in a more real-time way. So building this flexibility that says, hey, we may love this campaign, but we understand that we're going to learn something. Hopefully folks love it, right? But that will still cause us to do something different. It could be a tweak in which media we put it on or is most effective. It could be which format is working the most. It might be a change in the message, right? To help make this even stronger. And the next slide, please. And the correlate to this is we must be open to learning, being surprised, and adapting parts of our business, right? Again, in the past, we'd spend so much time developing that target audience, but data may show us there's a different target audience, right? And that's certainly something that we've learned about in the wine industry is, you think you have this specific consumer and you find out, wow, that person is buying, but there's a lot of other people buying. And, to me, what this means is that this monolithic view of the consumer is over. There's no more composite consumer. And I think, again, back to my P&G days, and we would, come up with a name. We'd say, okay, Sally is the purchaser of Tide, and she has 2 kids, and she lives in the Midwest, and here's her hobbies. And we'd have this monolithic consumer, but the reality is there is no average consumer. And we may find that while there is a Sally, there's also a Joe and a Jane and other consumers. And when we are open to data, we can be surprised and find out there's people who are loving our products that we didn't know that we can now talk to, and that we can actually target separately with a slightly different message. There may be folks who are using our product differently that may give us a new occasion that we can, go after as a potential new market or way to build into our existing market. So, the key with living in a more data-driven culture is we need to be open to being surprised. And however much research we do going into something, we need to have the expectation that we're going to learn something that can help us tweak it and make it better. Excuse me. So next slide. And then the next to really go down to people, which is the key to delivering our business, and then we'll open up to questions. But one is that winning cultures will always be the key, right? It's diversity, empathy, and open-mindedness are especially critical. And this goes back to what we were just talking about. If you think about the idea that we don't just kind of set it and go, that we have to set it and always be learning. We need folks from diverse point of views with diverse backgrounds, because we won't see everything if we have one point of view, right? We won't see the data the same. We won't be open to that. Empathy is key, because it really is about saying it's no longer, did I get the right message? It's what your consumers are saying. What are they seeing and learning? And are we understanding, really listening to the consumer and what they like or don't like about our brand, or how they're interacting with it? And that's why open-mindedness is key. Is in a world of more data, we have to accept the fact that it's not about being right the first time. It's about, kind of doing our best, but then taking, learning, adapting, and always redirecting based on what consumers are telling us. So it really is this open-mindedness and almost this humility that says, hey, we're going to give the best starting point, but the beauty now is our consumers can talk to us in a way they couldn't before. So there's going to be this constant cycle of refinement that if we're open-minded and listen, we can really make an even better fit between our product and what the actual consumer need is, or who the consumer is. And the final point, next slide, please, is just, the idea is that we must incorporate this always-on transformation mindset as we build teams across all parts of our HR system, right? And if you think about this, it used to be we would often focus on things like technical mastery, ability to work with teams, also very important. But now adaptability becomes a key skill that we need to look for. Problem solving remains a key factor, but it's problem solving in an evolving world, and flexibility in thinking, and the ability to incorporate very quickly and with humility to then continue evolving an idea. And we need to think about this as we evaluate our employees, for example. How do we hone in on the ability to make decisions and reevaluate decisions when necessary? It's not just about did they make the right decision to start. It's, as they evolved and took in data and information, how did they handle the change and how did it evolve from that? So, in short, it was really about what has someone learned, right, that we did when we were interviewing, for example. Today, it's about, has this person showed the ability to learn and the curiosity that fuels it? That is really the key skill, right? So it's really about the ability to adapt and change. That's something that we need in recruiting and hiring, and in developing our folks, and even measuring and evaluating and helping folks get ready for the next level. So I know a lot of different ideas. Hopefully this gave you a sense, both as to why we want to think about an always on culture. It's, just the closing thought I'll give you is that fueled this conversation was, we have so many, groups we work with who come in and would do projects on change, but then leave and not think about the ongoing piece. And I think, for me, the key learning over the past decade or two is, of course, we want to have people come in and show us how to change. We want to make sure that we have ways to continue to change, continue to drive process. And it's not finding a new method of working today. It's finding that way that will always show us the new methods, giving the speed, if you will, that business is happening. And, back to the earlier conversation about Moore's laws, as we're seeing our business change so fast, so rapidly, it's that open-mindedness and flexibility is really that key that can help us thrive and win in business. So hopefully some of this was helpful, and we'll pass back to Andrea if there's any questions or thoughts or comments.
Okay, that was great. I'm taking a look at the chat box. If you do have, I guess I should come back on camera. There we go. If you do have questions, please go ahead and drop them into the chat box. If not, we're going to get started, at least with questions that I have that were burning as you were going through. Okay, I thought I was on camera. There we go. There were so many great points that I thought you made, Billy, and I'm going to go ahead and get it started as people are formulating their questions. Can you speak a little bit about the fact that we know whenever a change is initiated in an organization, it starts with the leaders first. Can you speak a little bit how leaders can model that change if they want to produce a culture that is in tune with kind of all the evolving things that are happening today?
Yeah, I love that question, Andrea. And I think that, to me, one of the most important things that leaders need to model is this idea is that, of course, we want to set goals, set kind of expectations, focus on the consumer, focus on great product. But what we need to model is that humility to understand and learn, and that ability to empower and listen to other points of view. I think that's really the key thing is there's so much data and information coming in. And I think that, gone are the days that we could know everything. You think of kind of the Ben Franklins of the world, where they kind of were like experts on everything, or even the early days of P&G, where you could know everything there was because it was really just TV advertising. It was like one primary vehicle. I know I'm being a little bit simplistic here, but now there's so many new forms of media, even within social media, where the difference between a TikTok expert and a Facebook expert is different. Mm-hmm. How you do community management is different. So I think as leaders, the most important thing we need to do is role model humility and curiosity and open-mindedness, and really make sure that all the folks' voices in our organization are heard and incorporated. And to me, what we need to really do is make sure that what we're doing is helping drive change and showing the willingness to be flexible and the willingness to pivot. Because I think that's what folks look to do. They see, is a leader willing to leave their assumption and let the consumer really drive it, right? And so I think that those are the behaviors. It's really humility, and it's open-mindedness, and the willingness to really listen, to our employees and listen to our consumers.
Yeah, because one great point in listening to you say that is we're not going to know everything. It's changing so much. I mean, I don't know how many people got on TikTok during the pandemic. That would have been me. Before then, I didn't know about it. So we have a question that is from the viewers. Do you believe always on HR is meant for all companies and all industries, or maybe more for tech and marketing companies?
I think that's a great question. I actually think the idea of always on, I actually think is for all, because and it may look different, right? So I don't think the formula is the same, but if you think about, even just the changes, I think when I started, so I was a Gen Xer, and no one talked about Gen X or Boomers or things like that. We had people who worked, and I say that because what we see now is, as we see Millennial, we see Gen Z, we see differences now in generations that we never articulated before. And I think part of, and I think in HR, this is especially important is, we've seen a lot of trends which make HR important, right? And just, one example, right? It used to be, companies did business, right? You look today, when you look at, everything from the Black Lives Matter movement to Don't Say Gay to, Roe v. Wade, companies are now expected to take positions. Like you have to be open to them. That's a huge change, right? That HR departments never had to deal with before. Can you ever imagine? I certainly can't. 20 years ago, a Supreme Court decision came on, and our HR team is partnering with our management to say, how do we talk to employees, right? So I think there are definitely aspects in terms, and right now, right, from the Great Resignation to flexibility at home. I mean, HR departments are working overtime everywhere, answering these questions and having to be flexible in ways that 3 years ago we never thought we would. So
Absolutely.
I think, right, and the speed of HR and how we work, it's probably more than anything has just completely pivoted in such a short amount of time. So I do think there's aspects of always on transformation that we have to be able to do, and who knows where it ends, right? We've gone from always in the office to now very flexible in many places, and who knows what the new model will be, other than the fact that we're going to keep changing and learning. So I do think that mindset is important regardless of your industry or function.
Yeah, completely agree with that one. And thank you, Chrissy, for that question. Another question here. If you talked a lot about this switch going from consumer push model to where we are today. How does a brand not lose itself if it is all about the brand engagement and seeing what the consumers say, and this move away from traditional kind of marketing and branding? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, and I love that question. And I would just say a couple of thoughts on that. The first is, you still have to define what the brand stands for, right? And some things the brand will always own. What is the product? How does it reach to consumers? How does it interact? What are the guidelines? So you still have to think about that in really tremendous detail. It's just recognizing that there's now more touch points because consumers are talking back to it. I think you want to be open-minded to that piece. But I think the other piece is, it really is, you're setting the stage for how consumers perceive you as a brand, but you really have to be open to the fact that the unexpected is going to happen, right? There's always going to be something in the brand that we never thought of before. And, think about, brand response. I just use the example of brand responses to, the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, right? There are a lot of brands that were really impacted by that, right? By their response. And was it strong enough or was it not? And Roe v. Wade, and there's a lot of companies that folks have said, hey, you didn't make a strong enough statement, right? So I think we have to be ready for the fact that there's going to be these unexpected factors. And it's how do we then deal with it, right? So someone says, you didn't do enough when the Roe v. Wade decision came out from employees or consumers and hadn't planned for that. It's just something you then have to build and incorporate within the brand. And I think what it does mean is brands need to be ready to speak out on issues they might not have before, whether it be issues outside the brand, like the ones I just mentioned, or maybe there's an unexpected use occasion with, or something that happens within the brand use experience that also needs to be addressed. So, I think that the short answer is, one is be ready and continue to focus on the equity. But two, you have to have the skill set, knowing that something you don't expect is going to happen, right? And I think that's a key part of, and you can plan for that. You can certainly scenario say, what if this happens? What if it's a healthcare product and there are things that you can predict on how you would react, but there's other things that are just happening in real time that are going to impact the brand that you just need to have a team that has that flexibility to handle them as they come up.
Yeah, that's great. That just reminds me of one of the points that you made earlier, your point number 2 around trust, advising us about trusting deeper in the organization. Can you talk a little bit more about your experiences around that? The world has changed so much. People don't trust their neighbors anymore. So how do we build a culture that produces this level of trust inside of it?
Yeah, no, I love that question. And I think a lot of it is, one is you have to have a lot more conversation with your teams, right? It's not as much of a cascade down, if you will. It's really more a dialogue with the team. And so I think it's, it goes back to the idea of saying, set the guidelines, but it's no longer a top-down development, because you need to, share perspective, but then understand, if you're, for example, working with the community management team, they may say, hey, I get you want, Kim Crawford to stand for this, but that doesn't help me because these are the questions I get, right? So you really need to have that ongoing dialogue with your teams. And that's, just one example, but I think the idea is it can no longer be kind of a cascade of information. Certainly you need to start with the point of view. I think you need to bring a lot more voices in early, because that message is going to go to so many more places. And you want to have, again, back to this idea of diverse points of view, you have to have people think about how will a range of consumers, or stakeholders, it doesn't have to be consumers, it could be retailers, it could be whatever kind of stakeholders there are going to think about this. So if you don't spend time early listening and getting all those perspectives, then you're just not going to be informed as a brand or be ready as a situation might happen.
Yeah. When I think about the diverse voices and being able to get it, you also have to have that type of leader that understands how to leverage those diverse pieces as well. So another question for you, Billy, around the fact of you talked about going from this monolithic view of the consumer to something a little bit richer. So can you talk a little bit about that process? If a company or an organization is in that transition of transformation, how do they make that change from, hey, we're used to looking at the consumer this way from this monolithic view? Because I remember being in that kind of research when I was at P&G, to now something much more complex. It may not be Betty in the Midwest. It may be Judy in the South, kind of thing.
Right.
Can you speak
No,
about that?
I love that. It's something that I'm certainly learning, in this, new role at Constellation. That's, certainly we do research to give us a great starting point, and we need hypotheses, right? But I think, what I've learned is we do this and we start saying, well, let's understand who really is using for example, using our product. And you have to be open to being surprised, right? And of course, most likely, if you've done your work, done your research, done the work before, you're probably right on who that, kind of primary target is, but you'll learn a lot more about who they are and who others are, for example, who are using that or why, right? And so, for example, Kim Crawford may be primarily suburban moms, but then you found out that, wow, there's a lot of, urban gay males who use this. There's a lot of, older Southern folks who like folks out of demographics that you didn't think were the core. And you say, well, what does this mean? And why do they love it? How do they love it? And how do we talk and build relationships with consumers? And even if they're not the biggest driver, it may still be a Midwest mom. And these are just, hypothetical audiences I do, but that's using the product. There's a lot more potential, a lot of people who are interacting with and loving this product. And let's understand why, because we might learn something about the product, but also we can have conversations with them. And what's different now is, before, in a world of, kind of push TV, it was hard to kind of, target, right? I mean, TV is pretty blunt as an instrument, right? People, you can't, control. I can say, hey, if I want to talk to, a single urban gay male, I can find ways to target them. Or if I want to talk to a house, like a mom of 2 kids, I can target her, and I can target them with relevant messages in a way that I couldn't before, because you had one TV commercial that everyone was seeing. Now with digital media and social media, you can stay true to the brand and what the brand delivers and wants to be. You can have conversations on a more relevant topic or relevant aspect or use of the brand that you couldn't use before. So to me, that's what's really exciting about this, is you certainly want to start with hypotheses, but sometimes you got to let the data and say, I thought this was a Midwest brand, but it's selling more in the Northeast. Or I thought this was a primarily Gen X brand. It seems like Gen Zers really like this even more, and be open to that and understand what that means. And then, pivot if it makes sense to, but at the very least, take the understanding. It doesn't mean you change your brand equity or what you stand for, but it may change who you talk to and how you message that group.
Yes, I heard so much in what you said. Not only do we need to change how we think about going about doing the research, but even the tools that we're using to collect the data, because we're only as good as the data that comes in. So thank you for sharing a broader perspective on that question. This next question goes back to an earlier question that was about HR changing and being always on too. You had mentioned in there about now the way we look for talent should also change, looking for people who are open to learning. Any thoughts or any experiences you had about how do you kind of find that ability in someone? Because people can say, yes, of course I'm open to learning, but how do you test that before you get them into the company when you're looking at talent?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and definitely one of the hardest ones. I think, for me, it's really just trying to make sure that, talk through, either theoretical or actual examples, right? I think, talking to saying, show me a time that you've pivoted, right? And really, I think that's when you want to push folks on, it's funny, why I found myself as I interview folks now, the questions I spend a lot more time on is, tell me the biggest thing that you've learned. You take the negative, don't say what's your failure, but talk to me about really, what did you learn? Like, what's something that you really unexpected? And I think you very quickly find folks who are like, oh my, I learned this, right? And I think and it is a mindset shift, because it shifts you away from saying it's a failure to it's something I've learned, right? And the fact is, in whatever we're doing now, if we're not learning, and it's not about being right or wrong, right? It's the world is changing. If you asked someone 3 years ago, would you ever allow someone to be remote? Most people would have thought you were crazy. Now it's so that wasn't a wrong answer. That was just something that's evolved over time. So I think it's really trying to push people to understand how they think about change. And then I think the other thing is just say, so talk, here's an environment. What would you do if this happened? I think it's hypotheticals on, what happens when there's pivots in the business. I don't think there's a magical formula that does that, but I think it's asking about either past experiences or feelings on if something changed, something were to change, how they would react. I think those are some of the key areas, to focus on. Asking about, so what's something that you were curious about, and how did you go about, either learning or investigating that?
Yes, that's great. Because I think the more we can challenge ourselves in how we look for talent, the more we can get to the kind of cultures that embrace some of these different ways of thinking. So there's still time for questions. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We have about 5 more minutes or so left in our Q&A portion or so. And I want to make sure that if you have a burning question, you spend the time to kind of get it answered today. All right, because if not, I'm going to ask my questions. Billy, you mentioned that those toys. Let's go back to one of your experiences. Were for boys. I just need to say that I love G.I. Joe. I loved He-Man and Transformers. So little girls love those shows too. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences? You introduced that as a way to kind of show us about those brands. Can you talk a little bit about that experience versus kind of the things that you do now on the wine brands, and kind of what you learned that kind of helped you develop this mindset of transformation?
Yeah, absolutely. And there, it was certainly Hasbro but were some of my favorite brands as well. And to me, so what I'm passionate about is brands that, touch people's lives and that they have a deep emotional connection to. And if you think about, I think about, G.I. Joe. I have a twin brother, and we used to collect and organize and play. And so there's a lot of emotion. I think, being in wine, people love wine. It's part of, family events. It's something that people, really enjoy and have passion for. And I think, what's interesting with that is, in toys in particular, it's very much entertainment and content driven, where in wine, or kind of more, say, consumer, like traditional consumer products, it's really more experience driven. In other words, do I love the wine, right? Like at the end of the day, if you try a wine and it tastes great, you're going to want it again. If it doesn't, you're not going to have it again, right? So for me, I think, with both of those, it really is just, it really comes down to understanding the consumer and what do they love and how are things evolving, right? In the case of toys, it really evolved. Play patterns are very similar. How boys and girls play today, and to your point too, boys and girls, it's not as like boys and girls, like it's really about brands versus boys, but how people play, right? There's only so many ways you play. Learning, you play organizing, you play storytelling. Like those things have changed. It's more the how, right? And the navigation there is how do we break through when there's so much content. So that to me is where the evolution has changed. I think in something like wine, it's also, if you've ever looked at a wine shelf, it is hard, right?
Yes.
It's, you have the brands that you love, right? And that to me is where branding becomes so important. If I look at the wine shelf and I feel like, and I've only been in the industry a bit under a year, but I just feel like every time I look, there's something else I hadn't seen, right? There's just a lot happening there. but to me, it's the principle is the same, which is, how do we understand, how the consumer is thinking and what's changing, and how do we break through from that? So I know there's a little bit of a meandering answer, but I think, to me, the similarity is really how do we stay relevant, and what can we learn? Because, just as in entertainment, there's new entertainment changing, tastes change, and that's one thing that surprised me in the wine industry is you see trends coming out. Sweeter wines are becoming a bigger trend. Low calorie wines are becoming a bigger trend. So, it's that same idea about listening and adaptability and saying, I can look and say it's these traditional categories of wine, or I can say, hey, there's some innovation happening, and how do we lean into that? And it all goes back to listening to the consumer and following trends and saying, oh, wow, maybe this is bigger than I thought, or maybe this is something I should look at. So I think those pieces kind of stay the same. It's just understanding that, whatever industry you're in, there are going to be trends that you didn't expect, right? So in kids, it's the amount of just the challenge of getting their attention has been the big change, or one of them. And I think in wine, it's just really understanding trends in terms of like flavor and who's drinking and why, and what's important, and what are those trends that we need to be listening to and following.
Awesome. I just had to ask that question, going from toys to, like, I guess, grown people toys
Exactly.
with wine.
Yes.
We got time for one more question. So if we don't have another question in the chat, I'm going to ask you any parting words as you kind of tie a bow on all the things that you have shared with us today.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, again, first of all, thank you, Andrea, for having me on. It's a topic I'm passionate about. I think the key is just be open-minded and curious, and I think that, for me, the sigh of relief, and kind of understanding this change is, so much of our career has been kind of trying to find the answer. And I think the sigh of relief is when we realize whatever the right answer is today, it's going to change. But if you can find joy and excitement, to me, the ability to actually, learn from other people, to realize that whatever decision we're making is change can be exhilarating and exciting. And I just, I think if we challenge ourselves to really listen and understand, like, I love the HR question, right? I mean, how you hire, like, what do we do now? And I think just embrace those as parts of good change. And hopefully that can become a competitive advantage if you or your company can build that skill to really be flexible and adaptable, staying true to your core and your principles, but understanding what that's going to look like when the world is going to change. So that would just be my thought, is hopefully find joy in the idea that things are changing, and, it gives you more room to be a leader by being the first to kind of jump on those changes.
Yeah, I love that. To be the first to jump on the changes. Yeah, which means you have to be ready. So I'm going to switch back to our deck for some last minute announcements as we kind of transition to the end of today's discussion. It's been great. I have so many take-home messages and challenging me to think differently, especially about that question about HR and how we ask about it. So thank you for sharing your perspective on it. So a few announcements as we kind of close the August webinar is, one, mark your calendars to join us next month at September 13th, same time at 9 a.m. Eastern, for Adam Newton, who is P&G VP and Associate General Counsel of Ethics and Compliance Office. He will be speaking on the topic, can you innovate in a compliance-focused environment? Tips on how to continue evolving. I feel like we're going to continue this kind of conversation of how we can still be adaptable, but there are rules and all that kind of stuff. So make sure you come back and join us for that. And also, if you're not getting all of our updates and emails, please do go on pgalums.com and sign up for the updates. And if you are in the mood to kind of donate, you can also visit pgalumnifoundation.org. So remember, in our opening, I talked about we do have a foundation as a way to do philanthropic acts. Partner with us. You can go to sponsor@pgs.com and then volunteer, start, join a chapter, or any other thoughts you have that could enrich in this experience that we have. This is just one of the things that we offer through the alumni. So those kind of things, you can email us at hello@pgalums.com. And also, today's session is being recorded. So if you're not already following, go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel for the P&G Alumni Network. Today's session will be uploaded to there in a matter of a few weeks. So you can share it broadly, where the webinar is just for PG alumni only. The actual recording can go anywhere. So do share it in your network and make it make sure you have an opportunity to share it more broadly. So one last thing is, if you want to email us, have some thoughts, suggestions, speaker suggestions, you can do that at hellopgalums.com. So with that, I'd like to please join me in thanking our speaker one more time for joining us, taking time out of your early morning to jump on today's call all the way from California. And I wish you the best of luck on your transformation journey, everyone. Thank you. That's it. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.